They won't say it on camera, but the truth in Western war rooms right now is simple. Pakistan was supposed to be a regional problem, and it just walked into the big leagues. A country everyone budgeted for as India-focused is suddenly test-firing 750-kilometre terrain-hugging cruise missiles on September 30, 2025, buying 8 Chinese submarines and signing a mutual defence pact with Saudi Arabia that drags its military reach straight into the Gulf. That is not routine modernization. That is a fast-tracked, China-backed capability build that keeps showing up where NATO navies, US carriers and European energy interests actually live. And that, more than anything Islamabad says, is why the alarms are going off. Western defense officials aren't spooked by labels, they're spooked by speed. Pakistan was supposed to modernize in slow, visible, budget-constrained waves. Instead, in barely 3 years, you see fourth-plus-generation Chinese J-10C fighters inducted with fanfare in Islamabad, complete with beyond-visual-range loadouts and Chinese officials on the tarmac, a very public signal that Beijing is underwriting the jump in capability. What makes analysts in London, Brussels and Washington twitch is that this didn't happen after a 10-year tender interoperability trials and Western export licensing. It arrived almost turnkey from a single supplier ecosystem that doesn't lecture Pakistan on human rights or budgets. You go from older Mirages and F-7s to J-10Cs in a political season, not a generation. And that compresses warning time for everyone else in the neighborhood. At the very same moment, the platform that was meant to be Pakistan's affordable workhorse, the JF-17, quietly becomes something else. Block 3 is no longer just a light fighter. It's carrying an ESA radar, it's integrating the PL-15E with export range that outruns what India fields on some of its current missiles. And it's doing this at a price point small and medium air forces watch closely. When a country can roll out 30-plus Block 3s by 2024 to 25, while still operating earlier blocks, what you get is not a token upgrade, but a growing fleet with contemporary sensors, data links, and Chinese long-range air-to-air weapons. That is the definition of capability stacking. You don't retire the old, you add the new on top of it. Western planners look at that and realize their India-facing assumptions age out faster than planned. Then you add the ground and strike layer. Pakistan isn't just buying shiny jets. It's building the architecture to use long-range conventional missiles under a single command, the new Army Rocket Force, announced after the 2025 India clash. That means the state wants repeatable, organized conventional strike, not one-off prestige tests. And right on cue, you see the Fatah series firing in the background. First the 400-kilometer class Fatah 2, then the terrain-hugging 750-kilometer Fatah 4, with navigation designed to beat air defenses. Now line those 3 tracks up. Chinese high-end fighters, a domestic co-produced 4.5 Genlight jet with Chinese missiles, and a maturing long-range conventional strike arm. That's not random procurement, that's a synchronized acceleration curve, and Western defense circles know that when a country accelerates this broadly, this fast, and this closely tied to China's supply chain, it becomes harder to deter, harder to sanction, and harder to predict. What Western defense circles see when they look at Pakistan right now is not a country buying a fighter here and a ship there, but a country plugged into a Chinese defense conveyor belt that keeps delivering capability across air, sea, and missiles. The JF-17 story is the clearest illustration of this. It starts as a joint China-Pakistan project to replace old Mirages and F-7s, but within 2 decades, Pakistan Aeronautical Complex at Camera is doing 58% of the airframe work. It has the tooling, the engineers, the documentation, and it can roll out around 24 aircraft a year with Chinese support. That is not just procurement, that is ecosystem building, and it gives Pakistan a domestic platform it can upgrade, export, or integrate with Chinese weapons whenever Beijing clears it. Then, on top of this co-produced fighter, China can layer higher-end capability very quickly. The J-10C episode is the perfect example. Pakistan confirmed the purchase in early 2022, and the aircraft were on the flight line in time for the March 23 parade the same year, meaning China could deliver a 4.5 generation fighter with AESA radar and PL-15 class long-range air-to-air missiles in months, not years. Western militaries take careful note of delivery timelines like that because they tell you this isn't a one-off favor, it's a mature supply pipeline that can surge when Islamabad asks. The same pattern shows up at sea. Pakistan signed for 8 Hangor-class submarines with China, 4 to be built in China, 4 to be built at Karachi shipyard under transfer of technology. That is China exporting not just hulls, but know-how, processes, and underwater warfare capability to a partner sitting on the Arabian Sea. For Western navies that operate in the Gulf and Indian Ocean, this is the kind of deal that changes the undersea picture because it means new AIP-capable boats, Chinese sensors, and Chinese anti-ship missiles will enter the theater on a schedule already visible in Wuhan and Karachi. It also tells analysts that Pakistan's relationship with China is long horizon. You do not split-build 8 submarines unless you intend to depend on that supplier for decades. Layered over all of this is Chinese help on missiles and guidance, which Western think tanks and press have been writing about for years, and which 2025 reporting says has continued despite US sanctions. When a state can get fighters, missiles, and submarines from the same foreign partner, co-produce some of it at home, and then start exporting JF-17s to third countries like Azerbaijan using the same industrial base, Western defense circles stop seeing it as Pakistan shopping around and start seeing it as China creating a turnkey, loyal, interoperable outpost on India's western flank and at the mouth of sea lanes NATO actually uses. That is the depth that alarms them, because once such a pipeline is entrenched, it is extremely hard for the West to dislodge, outbid, or control through export restrictions, and that leaves Beijing with one more real-world test range for its systems right next to a live rival state. Western defense circles start paying much closer attention to Pakistan the moment its missile and strike programs stop looking like one theater, India-only deterrence, and start looking like regional reach. The Fatah family is the clearest new signal. Pakistan began with Fatah 1 at around 140 km, a useful precision tool for a land war with India, but by late 2023 and into 2024, it was already test-firing Fatah 2 with a 400-kilometer class range and advanced navigation designed to defeat missile defenses. Then in September 2025, the Army announced Fatah 4 at 750 km terrain hugging, with modern avionics meant to slip past radar. That turns a guided rocket system into something approaching a theater-level conventional strike weapon, able to hit air bases, naval facilities, logistics hubs, even nodes sitting safely behind the first line. It is at that point that NATO desks have to ask, why does a South Asian state under fiscal stress keep investing in longer legs and better penetration, unless it wants options beyond the line of control? Parallel to that is the older but still evolving Babur cruise missile line. Babur started life in the mid-2000s as a ground-launched Tomahawk-style system meant to give Pakistan a survivable, low-flying, radar-evading option with 500-700 kilometers of reach. Over the years, the Army has shown variants, multi-tube launchers, even a sea-launched Babur 3 to give second strike credibility. By 2024, the technical write-ups from CSIS and Pakistani sources still put it at up to 700-kilometer terrain mast and capable of both conventional and nuclear payloads. A subsonic, terrain-following cruise missile of that range can threaten more than Indian forward core. It can threaten radars, AWACS supporting bases, and partner facilities sitting along the Arabian Sea rim. Once those are in play, Western planners who sail carrier strike groups through those waters have to map possible Pakistani launch areas onto their own operating picture. What really raises eyebrows, though, is that even as these tests roll forward, the United States is sanctioning 4 Pakistani entities in December 2024 for work on the ballistic and long-range missile program, naming the National Development Complex and linked firms, and Pakistan still keeps testing. That tells NATO analysts 2 things. First, that the missile program has external support and internal political cover resilient enough to absorb US pressure. Second, that the program's design logic is not capped at India, because if it were, sanctions from Washington would have been a strong signal to pause, and Islamabad didn't pause. A 700-kilometer terrain-hugging precision strike system sitting on Pakistan's coast can create targeting dilemmas for US assets, Gulf partners, and even European ships in certain deployments. So the alarm is not because Pakistan suddenly became a global strike power. It is because the vector of its missile development points outward, away from a narrow India-Pakistan box, into a space where Western militaries actually operate. That outward vector, confirmed by continued testing in 2025 despite sanctions in 2024, is what shifts the conversation in Western defense circles from regional balance to theater access and force protection. When Western defense analysts look at Pakistan's recent moves, what makes them sit up is not only the weapons, it's where those weapons are starting to go and which political doors they are opening. The JF-17 sale to Azerbaijan is a textbook example. A country that was once only an importer is now delivering 4.5 generation class JF-17C Block 3 fighters to Baku, reportedly in a multi-billion-dollar framework, and those jets arrive inside an already tight Ankara-Islamabad-Baku triangle. That turns Pakistani defense output into a tool for shaping the South Caucasus, a theater where NATO members and Russia both watch air power balances closely. When an airframe co-developed with China is flown by an ally of Turkey against the backdrop of Armenian vulnerability, Western planners read it as Chinese-enabled Pakistani kit entering contested European-adjacent airspace. This export push is not a one-off. At Ideas 2024 and again in 2025, Pakistan was openly talking about tens of billions of dollars worth of MOUs for drones, smart munitions, radars, and trainers, much of it targeted at the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia, precisely the markets where Western countries try to preserve standards, access, and political leverage. If a partner can buy an armed UAV, a radar, and a light fighter from Pakistan, often with Chinese subsystems, often without Western human rights conditionality, it weakens NATO's ability to make defense sales part of a broader governance package. It also gives Beijing an indirect channel. Every Pakistani export built around Chinese avionics or missiles becomes another footprint for Chinese tech in a third country, masked as South-South cooperation. That is why Western circles call it an ecosystem, not a sale. The Gulf layer deepens the alarm. In September 2025, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia signed a strategic mutual defense pact, treating an attack on one as an attack on both, with Islamabad later signaling that Riyadh sits under its nuclear umbrella and that other Arab states could join. For Western militaries, the Gulf is a logistics lifeline, a basing hub, and the stage for coalition operations. A Pakistan-Saudi defense condominium inside that space complicates US and NATO leverage and gives Riyadh an alternative to Washington precisely at a time when US-Saudi security talks have been uneven. When the same Pakistan is also courting Saudi investment and launching an economic cooperation framework in October 2025, defense and diplomacy begin to reinforce each other, creating a partner in the Gulf that is armed, politically aligned, and willing to bring Chinese-derived capability into a region the West wants to keep interoperable. Add in the trilateral signaling with Turkey and Azerbaijan, The one nation, three states rhetoric, joint drills, talks on future air projects, and the picture that forms in Western briefing rooms is of Pakistan turning defense production into diplomatic gravity. Countries that buy its fighters will invite its trainers, will host its officers, will start using Chinese missiles cleared through Islamabad, and will be less dependent on NATO's standard kit. That is not just Pakistan getting richer on exports, that is Pakistan, with Chinese help, creating a parallel defense lane for states that want capability without Western strings attached. What makes Western defense circles most uneasy is that Pakistan is becoming the place where Chinese systems get real-world against a peer or near-peer validation, something Beijing itself has very limited opportunity to do in its own region, because any clash with India, Japan, or US forces in the Western Pacific would be politically explosive. When Pakistan flies Chinese J-10C fighters with PL-15 long-range air-to-air missiles in an actual engagement against Indian aircraft, and Pakistani officials quietly tell reporters that the Chinese were watching performance data very closely, that is gold for the People's Liberation Army and for China's arms industry, because it shows how their sensors, data links, EW suites, and missiles behave not on a range, but in a contested environment where the opponent is also using modern Western or Russian gear. That is exactly what happened after the 2025 skirmish, in which Pakistan reportedly used the J-10's PL-15 combo, and Chinese outlets celebrated the outcome as proof of concept for their weapons. From a NATO perspective, that is a problem because it shortcuts China's learning curve. Instead of waiting years to see how their air-to-air missiles fare against an opponent's countermeasures, they can watch Pakistan do it, review the telemetry, study what Indian sensors picked up, and then roll corrections into the next PL series or into export variants that will eventually compete with Western missiles in Africa, the Gulf, and Central Asia. Every time Pakistan uses a Chinese jet or missile successfully, Beijing gets a marketing win and a data win. Western defense planners see an emerging cycle in which China designs, Pakistan fields, Pakistan fights, China refines. Over time, that produces more mature Chinese systems than the West had expected for 2030. The same logic applies at sea. The 8 Hangar-class submarines China is building and co-building for Pakistan are not just about giving the Pakistan Navy more underwater punch. They are also about putting Chinese export submarines, Chinese torpedoes, and Chinese anti-ship missiles into the Indian Ocean, right where US, UK, French, and Italian ships transit. That creates opportunities to benchmark Chinese sensors and signatures against Western ASW behavior in a busy theater. It also gives China a long-term vantage point on how its export boats age, what kind of maintenance they need in warm, high-salinity waters, and how Pakistani crews actually employ them, information that can be folded back into PLA Navy doctrine or next-generation export models. For NATO, the headache is downstream. If Chinese kit keeps getting real combat or near-combat validation through Pakistan, the alliance will sooner or later have to plan for adversaries in Africa or the Middle East fielding Chinese fighters and missiles that are no longer theoretical but tuned using South Asian combat data, which means Western assumptions about detection ranges, no escape zones, and EW effectiveness stay accurate for shorter periods of time, and that compresses NATO's planning horizon in those theaters. When you line all of this up, the China-enabled fighter jump, the missile reach that now sits at 750 kilometers, the 8-boat submarine deal, and a September 17, 2025 mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia that effectively plants Pakistani military power in the Gulf, what Western defense circles see is not an isolated modernization, but a maturing Chinese partner state sitting across India's western flank and on sea lanes NATO uses. This is a force that can take Chinese kit, fight with it, feed the data back to Beijing, export parts of it to places like Azerbaijan, and now politically anchor it in Riyadh under a collective security clause. That is why the tone in Western briefings has shifted from Pakistan is modernizing to Pakistan is becoming a test bed and multiplier for Chinese power projection, because every successful Fatah 4 launch on September 30, 2025, extends the range problem for US and European assets. Every Hangar boat launched in August 2025 complicates undersea surveillance in the Arabian Sea, and every Saudi-Pakistan staff talk after the pact in Riyadh adds a political shield around those capabilities.